And to present to you on a project that is ongoing, one of the flagship projects of the CSIR. And it's called the Green Book, which is Adaptation Actions for South African Settlement at Risk of Climate Change. Just a little bit of context and background, and as a rationale for the project. Climate-related events account for 85% of all natural disaster events and 81% of all natural disaster-related deaths in South Africa. The most common are flooding, severe droughts, storms and wildfires, and others include lightning strikes, landslides, heat waves, hailstorms, windstorms, tornadoes. So over the last 4 decades, climate-related disasters in South Africa have resulted in approximately 5.4 billion rand in economic damages. And that's not even other indirect losses to the economy and livelihoods. An estimated 20 million people in South Africa have been immediately affected by drought, whereas floods and storms combined have affected an estimated 1.2 million people. So these numbers, these economic damages, the number of people that are impacted by natural hazards in South Africa, these damage recovery and rehabilitation costs generally reflects the reactive costs of disasters and highlights the importance of investment in proactive measures and disaster risk reductions. So there's a general rule of thumb that for every $1 you invest in disaster risk reduction, you save $7 to $10 in emergency response and recovery. So the 2015 drought in South Africa was one of the strongest El Nino events on record, and it brought about the worst drought since 1904 and the hottest temperatures on record in 150 years. It also had many direct and indirect impacts on society. So these recent drought conditions and also the associated impacts is a good indication of what can be expected in future if under similar scenarios of increased temperature and also severe drought. This table is a summary of the impacts of recorded climate-related events in South Africa for the last 4 decades. And if you just look at the red blocks, you will see that drought, floods and storms have had the most impact on our society in terms of the number of events, the number of deaths, the number of people left homeless, the injured, and also then the total damages in US dollars. So even without adapting to climate change, municipalities are already under tremendous pressure to address the many complex urban challenges, in most cases with limited resources and capacity. So the range of persistent and emerging urban challenges that South African towns and cities experience according to the UN Habitat include the following list. It's unaffordable housing, exclusion and rising inequality, congestion, air pollution, climate change, inadequate infrastructure, lack of capacity, insufficient public transportation, unplanned city extensions, excessive noise, informal settlements, insanitary water, an aging population while also having a surging youth, and lack of participatory processes. So cities' inherent vulnerabilities as part of their socio-economic and physical makeup and configuration are compounded by climatic changes and their impacts. So our Green Book, this is just the background and the rationale for our project. So the purpose of our project is to propose a suite of climate change adaptation actions with some guidelines on how to implement these for every settlement in South Africa, based on their respective risk profiles. So the project is divided into 6 steps. I'll show you those steps just now. And this project runs from March 2016 to March 2019, so we will be busy finalizing and wrapping up all the input and presenting it as a website. And it's funded by the IDRC, which is a Canadian donor funding, and the CSIR. It involves 50 researchers from multiple research groups in the CSIR built environment and natural resources and environment. And then many of you would be familiar with the Red Book, so it's complementary also to the Red Book, but it has a different focus and a different scale. We look more at a city-wide scale and not at specifically neighborhood design. The focus of the project is on generating scientific evidence. So everything I will show you hereafter is what this project has generated. We compile risk profiles based on this evidence, and then we link adaptation actions to each of these settlement profiles. The audience that we have in mind for the Green Book are people in local government involved in spatial planning, land use management, infrastructure development, municipal service provision, growth management, environmental planning and urban design. The Green Book is being developed as an interactive dynamic website, and we will also publish policy briefs, conference papers, journal articles, data sets, maps, and all of these will be publicly available. Implementation will only happen after the project has been completed in March 2019. So these are the steps that we followed in the project. The first step was and this is also the scientific evidence that was generated in the project. The first step was to downscale climate change projections for South Africa to an 8 by 8 kilometer grid. So many of you would know that most of the climate change projections are at a 50 by 50 kilometer grid. So for the first time, it's at an 8 by 8 kilometer grid, and we are able to see where cities fall in those grids, in that 64 kilometer square miles, and have a much better idea of what the impact of climate change will be on specific settlements. We've also done settlement vulnerability profiling and growth projections. So again, we've appointed a demographer to do projections for South Africa, and that doesn't really exist on a local municipal level. So we have an idea for every local municipality what the population will be doing, whether it will be growing, stagnating, or declining in future. I also have to say that our futures include a 2030, a 2050 future, and then for the climate change projections, also a 2100 future. But our settlement profiling is for 2030 and 2050. Then, using the climate change downscale projections, in many cases as an input, we did hazard assessments or hazard profiling and modeling. So we looked at the most prevalent climate-related events: flooding, drought, coastal flooding, groundwater and surface water availability, the impact on agriculture and on the macroeconomy. And I'm probably missing one or two, but I'll show the slides now. And we looked what will be those future hazards for a 2030 and a 2050 future for all for settlements in South Africa. They are different scales. So the coastal flooding is at a very high resolution, so we can see the finer details of people and buildings that are exposed to coastal flooding in future. And then drought is again at a regional scale. So we're able to see what the region is going to do, what's the frequency in drought that can be experienced in future for a specific region, and then see what settlements fall into that region. And then we put it all together into a risk profile. So on a website, you will be able to type in the name of your settlement. So some of it is on a local municipal level, but some of it is even broken down into settlements. For example, if you take Bloemfontein, you will be able to see both Bloemfontein and Botshabelo, which is a township associated with Bloemfontein or linked to Bloemfontein, but they are quite far apart geographically, so we treat them as separate settlements. And you will be able to, for every settlement, look up their risk profile. You will also be able to compare yourself with other settlements to see where, if your vulnerability is increasing or decreasing, and so on. So it will be a very strong and also complex online tool. And then the last step in the process is to link a menu of adaptation actions to each of these risk profiles. For example, if you are going to experience a higher frequency in droughts in future, then we propose a number of actions that you can implement now to be integrated into your urban planning, environmental planning, the disciplines I just mentioned now, to integrate that into your planning so as to adapt for future climate change. So showing you some of the analysis that we've done, and we're taking specifically Western Cape as an example, I think just because it's an interesting example. Some of the climatic changes over South Africa, I'm sure you're familiar with these, it's in the popular news often, is generally hotter average temperatures. On the coastal areas, it will be about 1 to 2.5 degrees Celsius changes. And then in the central areas, it will be up to 3 degrees Celsius changes by 2050 compared to a 2061 to 1919 period. Then also the minimum temperatures will rise. There will be increased wind speeds in certain parts of South Africa. I think also important for us in terms of settlements that there will be an increase in the number of very hot days. So that's temperatures exceeding 35 degrees. And that will often create urban heat islands. And then there will also be changes in rainfall. So rainfall is a little bit more uncertain than temperatures. And also in terms of the extreme rainfall events, there will be changes over most parts of South Africa, the eastern parts of South Africa, and also reductions in Lesotho and KwaZulu-Natal Midlands. So the accurate diagnosis of climate change risk and the vulnerabilities of urban populations and territory are essential for effective adaptation. So that's why we're going to the extents of creating the scientific evidence to see what will be the impact on South African towns and cities. In terms of the population projections that we've done for this project, you will see that the increase in population will mostly follow the worldwide trends, that there will be an increase in population growth, but also that most of that will happen in urban areas. So we expect at a medium projection that the urban population in South Africa by 2050 would be about 58 million people, whereas in the rural areas that would be 17 million people. This map just shows you the hotspots of where people will be added. So this is not this is the number of people that would be added to our settlements and the population change by 2050 relative to 2011. So this is a medium scenario. And this just highlights all the places where the population will be growing in future in South Africa. And you can see it's typically the metropolitan areas and then also other secondary cities across South Africa. Just looking at the Western Cape, I'm going to use the Western Cape now as an example to just showcase all of the findings that we have, but just that you realize we have this for every province and every local municipality, downscale to settlement level for the whole of South Africa. So in terms of the Western Cape population growth, this is the projected population growth at a medium growth scenario. And this map just shows you where people will be added to towns and to settlements. So there you can see that the metropolitan area of Cape Town, Stellenbosch, all of those areas there will be an increase in the number of people added to those municipalities. This slide just shows what the actual numbers will be of the population in future by 2050, according to our projections. So for example, just the city of Cape Town by 2050 will have about 5.1 million people. Now, we treat this, it's not the municipality, it's the city of Cape Town. So for example, we treat Strand as a separate settlement. So if you add Strand and Somerset West, then that number will increase in future, that it will be more than just the 5.1 million for the city of Cape Town by 2050. Then I think what is very powerful is we've developed these vulnerability indicators for every settlement in South Africa. So on the table there, you will see there's the socio-economic vulnerability index, the first one, then the economic vulnerability index, the brown one, the physical vulnerability is the blue one, and the environmental vulnerability is the green one. And you will see that for every this consists of a number of indicators that we've combined into one indicator, so a number of variables into one indicator that compiles the socio-economic vulnerability indicator. And then the trend is also indicated. So for the past 15 years, we have all this data available, so we can calculate whether that trend is increasing or decreasing, so whether their vulnerability is increasing or decreasing over time. And then we can also rank these municipalities, so you can see how do you compare with other settlements, I should say. So just a number of examples in this one, and then we can also break it down to say why it is so. So for example, for Tshwane that you see on the map there, the reason why it's got a relative high socioeconomic vulnerability is because of the high percentage of population that have no secondary education, and also the high percentage of households that live under the minimum living level. In terms of the environmental vulnerability, for Saldanha Bay, you can see that it is a low GDP production and a low GDP per capita, then also a low GDP growth. And therefore, the economic vulnerability is also increasing. Then for Stellenbosch, it is because it's got a low GDP production and high inequality. And then for Strand, you can see it's because of a low GDP production and low GDP per capita and an inequality, a high inequality in that area. For physical vulnerability, for Oeverstrand, one can see the reasons why it's got a low physical or high physical vulnerability, and also why it's increasing is because of the road infrastructure. There's a low road density. Because of the housing type, so there's a high percentage of informal and government subsidized housing. So those are just some of the variables that we use to compile those indicators and to show the trend over time. For environmental vulnerability, we do not have data to indicate the trend, but we do have data to just analyze the vulnerability. And in here you can see the city of Cape Town. Lou Allen has just referred to that on that map. Of Durban and Cape Town, that a lot of the settlements are encroaching on the green spaces, the natural spaces, and also on the water resources, the environmental health, low air quality. So there you see the number of reasons. So there's really a very high resolution of data in terms of the vulnerability of places. Then looking at the Cape Agulhas municipality, district municipality, we can also compare in the spider diagram, we can compare the various settlements in terms of the socio-economic, the growth pressure, service access economic. So we can compare them. And there you can see on that vulnerability index why certain places are vulnerable, where they are mostly vulnerable, and how do they compare to the others within the municipality. So I think it will be a very powerful tool to analyze the vulnerability of settlements. In terms of climate change, in terms of very hot days in the Western Cape in future, this map indicates the increased number of very hot days at a low mitigation scenario, in other words, a worst case scenario for a 2050 future for the Western Cape. And there you can see the darker brown areas indicating that there will be 40 to 50 more hot days by 2050 compared to the base year that was used. And I'm not sure, but I think it was the 1960 to 1990 year. But that is quite a huge increase by 2050 in the number of very hot days. Then we've used this data to also look at wildfire in future, and this map indicates the increase in the number of fire danger days by 2050 under a low mitigation scenario. And again, you can see the darker areas indicating that there will be an increase in the number of fire danger days by 2050. Then drought. So this map shows the increase in the drought frequency between 2040 and 2060 at a low mitigation scenario for the whole of the Western Cape, apart from the lower area that was unfortunately cut off. We'll rectify that. But then you can see the darker areas, the darker reddish colors, again indicating the increase in the frequency of drought between 2040 and 2060 compared to the base year. Then coastal flooding, as I said, we have this at a very high density. And on the map on the left, 2011, you can see the coastal flooding index. So that indicates by 2011, what is the potential of flooding for the Strand area. This map is of Strand. And you can see the very high to medium potential for flooding. And then also in the grids, the percentage indicated in those grid blocks is the percentage of people that are uninsured currently. So we also got that data from the insurance industry. So we are able to see, and that shows us a measure of vulnerability and exposure of people. So if those areas are flooded, then we also know the number of people that would be exposed, that would be uninsured and therefore vulnerable. If we look at the map on the right, the 2050 map, again it shows the coastal flooding index and the percentage of people exposed. And it's estimated that 10,751 people will be exposed to coastal flooding at a medium population growth scenario and using the IPCC sea level rise estimate. And there you can again see the very high, and medium exposure in the flooding index, and then the The black dots are all the buildings, and that helps us to determine the number of people that will be exposed to flooding by 2050. And based on all of these hazard maps, then we propose adaptation actions for every one of these settlements. So just the climate change impact on agriculture. For example, in the Drakensberg local municipality, their number one product is deciduous wine grapes, deciduous fruits, and because of a reduction in available winter chill and an increase in the number in this summer heat stress, the warming can negatively affect quality of grapes for winemaking. So I would suggest that you start buying wine and putting them away. And then also an increased evapotranspiration and irrigation requirements. So there's a reduced suitability for viticulture in that area by 2050. And then the second most important product is milk and cream. And because of the potential increase in heat stress, which could negatively affect conception rates, milk yields, and milk quality, it would also reduce. And then chickens, because of the increased production cost and increased investment, will be required in ventilation and cooling to maintain the optimal seasonal temperatures and reduce the risk of heat stress. The heat stress on the birds will reduce body weight gain, reproduction efficiency, and air quality. So again, we're looking at all of these agricultural, this impact on agriculture, and see how can we propose adaptation actions for the future for places to adapt. So getting to these place-based adaptation actions, some of the critical elements and networks considered as most likely to be impacted by climate change include the following list. So we looked at this list. These are most likely to be impacted, and we try to identify adaptation actions for all of these elements and networks. And this is a diagram that we're still working on, and this will be on the website. So it's also a bit hard to show it on a static presentation, but we've divided all of our adaptation actions. We've grouped them into spatial planning, land use management, landscape and urban design, your engineering services, and we've broken the engineering services down into water, energy, stormwater, sanitation, solid waste, mobility and transport, and then also environmental planning. Because we want to influence urban planning and the built up areas, because we're looking at settlements specifically. These are the main categories of adaptation actions. Then there will be a number of filters, so you can click on a filter. So as a separate tool, you can click on a filter to show you the specific actions that will, for example, address coastal flooding or heat stress. Then you can use even more filters to show you just the type of actions, a win-win, for example, where it's mostly good planning practice that you have to do anyway. It's like maintenance. So it's a win-win situation that most municipalities have to do anyway, but it's essential for adapting places to future climate change. Then there are the no regrets options. You will not regret doing it, but it will cost the municipality something in terms of available funding. And then you've got low regrets options, which will cost municipalities more. And there's a little bit of uncertainty in terms of the climate change, whether, there is a little bit of uncertainty in climate change. Therefore, it will be a low regrets option. Then you can also choose certain strategies. You can select all the identify, which is mainly the spatial planning options, your protect, which is mostly your land use management options, your design, which is linked to the landscape and urban design, and your maintenance, retrofit and new build, which is often under your engineering services or your environmental planning. Hopefully it will make a bit more sense when I show you a bit more detail. But so these adaptation actions will be a loose standing tool on the website, but they will also be linked to your risk profile automatically. So for example, if your local municipality, like the Western Cape I've just shown you, if you are at risk of coastal flooding and veld fires, a basket of options showing all of the coastal flooding and veld fire adaptation actions will show up on your risk profile and the report that you can print from the website. So it will link in both ways. So just showing you a couple of examples how it will work. You will see that the coastal flooding and the wildfire component is what we're going to talk about now, and also it will be win-win types and identify, protect and maintain options. So these are all the options that we have identified. I know the print is a little bit too small probably to read, that's okay. These are all the options that will come up if you select coastal flooding and wildfire. So under spatial planning, land use management, urban design and landscaping, environmental service and environmental planning, all of these options will show up. Then if you select only coastal flooding, you will see, and it is a win-win situation. You want a win-win option. You don't want a low regrets or a no regrets option. It will again pick up all the options relevant to your specific municipality, or if you only do a search on the tool. So, and then it will show up. There will be a description of every action. So this one will be your spatial planning action, which is a win-win type, and it is an identify strategy for coastal flooding, and it will say that you have to determine the coastal management lines. Now, what we're also trying to do is to link the adaptation actions together. So, for example, it will start with a spatial planning action that goes into a land use management action, and then works out into either or a combination of landscape and urban design, environmental engineering, and then also your environmental planning. So in this case, we selected the spatial planning option, which works out into a land use management option. So there's a strategy that you can follow. You first do your overall planning in terms of your spatial planning, then you protect it in your land use management, and then what that action is going to look like will show up under the other options. So this is your land use management option, where you say protect the coastal dunes from development. And then the third one in this line of options will be your environmental planning option, to say maintain and rehabilitate your dunes. Okay, and then if we go to the next action, which is for wildfires, on this slide it shows up that all the actions that will be picked up if you select a wildfire, that's a win-win situation for that area. So again, your spatial planning action will be to identify areas to be designated as fire breaks. So you first do that, then you protect your fire breaks in your land use management scheme or other tools that you have and instruments that you have available. You protect your fire breaks, and the last one is to create and maintain your fire breaks, which is an environmental planning option or an action. I hope that makes sense to you. It makes sense to us, but we're still working on it, and we're trying to portray it in such a way. You must understand this is going to be an interactive website. You're going to click a button and it will show up. So this is how we're trying to link actions to the risk, and also guide people on which actions to implement. So sorry, I should go back, but in the description, you will see there's a description of that action, what the goal is of that action, what's the benefits, the cost, and also some examples from places that have already implemented that. So it's highly unlikely that any single action on its own will suffice to deal with the impact, with the exception of a few, like a barrier for rising water. So actions need to be combined in a unique way, based on specific local conditions, including the physical location, the population size, whether your population is growing or declining, because if your population is declining, you will probably only select win-win types of actions and not those that has a high cost to the municipality. Also economic factors, and then also the capacity of a municipality. So it would be more appropriate to implement a basket of measures, so some that will mitigate the risks over a long term, and also some that would immediately address your short-term risks and have an adaptation impact. So it's important to consider that when exposed to any risk, any and all infrastructure that is of substandard quality or poorly maintained is obviously more likely to fail than well-maintained infrastructure. So many of these actions that we are proposing is simply good planning practice, but it is essential to mitigate the impacts of climate change. Just as a conclusion, so the evidence show that extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and intense with climate change. It's expected to amplify these trends, particularly as we saw floods, droughts, wildfires, and storms. More frequent and intense events, combined with a growing population, the increasing value in the urban and built environment infrastructure, poor land use practices, increasing number of people residing in informal settlements, and high-risk areas are likely to exacerbate the vulnerabilities of many settlements and communities to climate change. And also the overall level of disaster risk will increase in future. So this high exposure and vulnerability will transform even small scale, what we often call an onset disaster or event, into a disaster for some affected communities. Recurrent small or medium scale events affecting the same communities may have cumulative effects over time. Given these risks, there's a great need for proactive investment in disaster risk reduction and management in South Africa to cope with increasing extreme events in the future. And these are the adaptation actions that we are proposing. So building awareness, preparedness, and resilience to extreme events while adapting to incremental climate change is essential and needs to be a priority area for planning in South Africa. The National Climate Change Response White Paper identifies local government as the critical role player that can build climate resilience through the planning of human settlements and urban development, the provision of municipal infrastructure and services, water and energy demand management, local disaster response, among many of the factors. The white paper argues that to achieve this, local government should integrate climate change into their IDPs and other budgeting and planning instruments. It's also very important for the SDFs. The Green Book aims to facilitate this mainstreaming of climate change adaptation actions into local government planning instruments, such as the IDP and the SDFs. Thank you very much.